Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing incredibly well, and I hope you're going to treat yourself, spoil yourself, because you deserve to. Get yourself that sparkling drink or a very special something to eat, and if it's something that is very special to you, let me know about it, because I do love hearing from you. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Ariel, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1987 when my parents sent me away to a North American boarding school when I was about 13 years old. My family is initially from Seattle, but my father's job as a sports journalist and commentator invariably meant that the whole family was always being uprooted, which meant that I'd end up being pulled out of one school and placed into another, which was very unsettling for me as a child. No sooner had I laid down roots in one school, my father would be relocated once again, and I would be tossed into another school. My parents soon began to realise that this bobbing around from one school to another like the proverbial bee, buzzing from one flower to the very next, was clearly having a catastrophic effect on my grades and causing me a significant amount of distress. You see, growing up I was painfully shy and rather petite for my age, and whenever I relocated to another school, it took ages for me to make friends all over again, and I became like a fish out of water in a very strange environment. And being the new girl in the school was not a pretty place to be, especially for someone as withdrawn, reticent and reserved as myself. I truly felt like a goldfish in a shark-infested tank, fighting to survive and keep my head above water from one day to the next. There were occasions when I managed to make friends, but I never hung around with the hip crowd, so to speak, but usually with the waifs and strays that no one wanted to befriend. Somehow I felt much more at ease and relaxed hanging around with the social misfits because I was not confident or assertive, and besides, some of the so-called misfits were very amenable and congenial. After my parents continually received abysmal reports about my progress in school and my flagging grades, they began to believe that the lack of stability in my school life was causing me to lag behind, and that was when the horrifying idea of sending me to boarding school was finally born. "Look at Ariel's frightful report," my mother would say, looking at me with an expression of extreme disappointment on her face. "Listen to this, Ariel. What do you have to say about this?" The report read, "Ariel is struggling to fit in at school. She's a very quiet, withdrawn young girl who doesn't interact with the rest of the pupils or even make an effort to make friends. During class, Ariel daydreams and pays little attention to the lessons, and her lack of focus is subsequently affecting her performance at school. Her grades are extremely poor. I do believe that if Ariel was more attentive and interacted more during the lessons, she would produce much better results. I do not believe that your daughter lacks intelligence, but her motivation and disinterest are causing her huge setbacks, which is invariably compromising her performance at school." "What on earth is wrong with you, Ariel? Why don't you concentrate in class at all? And what about all this dreadful daydreaming business? How can you ever expect to succeed in school if you're not paying attention during class?" my mother snapped. "I hate school, Mum," I said. "The teacher's always picking on me. She hit me with a ruler on my knuckle because she said I wasn't paying any attention the other day, and all the kids just laughed, and they were whispering and sniggering at me behind my back." "Well, why weren't you paying any attention?" my mother snapped. "For goodness sake, you're a bright girl, Ariel. What on earth is going on with you?" "But Mum, I'm always the new girl at school, and nobody ever takes me seriously," I complained. "Nobody even talks to me." "It might just help, Ariel, if you made a teensy-weensy effort to make friends. We can't have you falling behind in your grades like this. You're a huge embarrassment to your father and I. For goodness sake, girl, pull your socks up." I remember hearing my parents discussing me in avid detail, as if I was a dreadful thorn in the side that needed to be dealt with at once. Then I heard my mother suggest to my dad that I went to boarding school, and the idea was utterly appalling to me, as I hated and dreaded school with a fervent passion, and the idea of sleeping on the enemy turf was the most terrifying thought of my entire life. It would seem that despite my tearful tantrums, begging, pleading and protesting, my mother was utterly determined that come hell or high water, I was going to boarding school whether I liked it or not. And that was that. And my father really didn't have much say in the matter at all. I remember he looked at me and said, "Ariel, you know what your mother's like. I have no say in the matter. If I had my way, you would stay at home. But you know who rules the roost in this household. It's always your mother." "But Dad," I protested, "you also have a say in the matter. Why do you let Mum always have her way?" "Because what's best is best, my dear. You know what your mother's like. When you're in a tiger's cage, you don't provoke the animal, or you might just be torn to shreds." "Mum," I begged, "please let me stay at home. I promise I'll work so much harder from now on." "You brought this on yourself, Ariel dear," my mother told me. "If it wasn't for your bad performance in school, we wouldn't be sending you to boarding school in the first place. Hopefully a bit of tough love with the matrons will bring out the best in your character." Growing up, I really loathed my mother, and I adored my father. The only problem with my dad was that he would always do whatever my mother wanted to appease her. You see, my mother was such a difficult, convoluted woman, and even my grandmother once told me many years later that she always believed my mother would end up having multiple divorces because she was such a taxing and tough person to live with. Certainly, as a child growing up, my mother's constant belittling and badgering of me was doing very little to engender any warm feelings of love towards her in my young heart, and now I began to despise her with all my being, and all the more now that she was insisting upon me being sent to boarding school. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and I was now in boarding school, hating and loathing every single minute of it, as you can imagine, and I was beginning to be bullied by the girls at school, who clearly thought I was backward and benighted because I was quiet as a church mouse, never saying a single word to anyone. I remember feeling so utterly hopeless and alone in this desolate, solitary world, and I longed to be at home with my loving dad. But I never missed my mother, not for a single moment. The girls at the school I was attending were from wealthy, very privileged backgrounds and were spoilt, coddled and belligerent, with nasty attitude of self-entitlement and inverted snobbery. They would incessantly talk about boys and clothes and shoes, and they tirelessly made fun of me and bullied me relentlessly. My fragile confidence was shattered like a fine piece of crystal glass, and my self-esteem plunged to great depths of despair, and things were becoming progressively worse as the bullying persisted. I was beginning to believe everything I was being told about myself. I was worthless and inadequate in every way, and my existence on this earth was a dreadful, dreadful mistake, because no one could ever want me, nor could anybody ever love me. I was all alone in the world, and there wasn't a solitary soul out there that could possibly care for me. Well, that's what those nasty girls tried to drill in me day and night, and I'm glad I didn't allow that to affect me. On reflection, I'm glad I was not living during the days of social media, because it's so much easier today for someone to tear you apart, limb from limb, which literally is the most vindictive thing you could possibly do, just at the press of a button. It boggles the mind that bullying still goes on today, but it's so much easier now than it was back then. So I really find that my heart goes out to people in that situation. I remember there was one girl called Lisa Bucker, and I still remember her surname all these years later, and she had long blonde hair that was so long that it fell down to her waist. I remember she had these cold, heartless blue eyes that stared at me with an intense hatred and revulsion, almost like I was the dog scat on her shoe. Lisa was the most popular girl in the class, and the leader of the wolf pack, so to speak, in the school, and she tore me at my self-esteem like a ravenous vulture, ravaging me from limb to limb, and delighting in every moment of it. "Look at silly little Ariel," she'd say. "Do you think there's anything in that little head of hers? Has she got a brain or not?" she would mock. "Does anybody know where my cotton wool balls have got to? Oh, yes, I remember. They're in Ariel's heads, because that's all that she's got in there, cotton wool. Everybody would clap and laugh as if Lisa was such a fabulous, incredible hoot and had the most amazing sense of humour. But for some God-forsaken reason, I became the butt of all her jokes, and she ridiculed me with so much gusto, much like a dog with a bone that just refused to let go. Before long, Lisa was sticking paper on my back with words like, "Kick me, I fancy a thump," or "I'm thicker than 2 planks, I've only got cotton wool for brains." And these notes were all designed to humiliate me. On several occasions she tore up my homework so that I got into trouble with the teacher for not completing it. It was absolutely awful. It would seem my quietness and dreadful shyness made me a huge target for all kinds of practical jokes, some that were too humiliating and soul-destroying to even put on paper and express to you and your listeners, because they bring tears to my eyes, even all these years later, just recalling them at all, because the deplorable things that those girls did to me breaks my heart even today. I just wish the adult in me could go back in time to that little girl that I was back then, and encourage her and to tell her to fight back and to put that evil, treacherous Lisa Bucker in her place. And that's what I'd say to any bully today. Don't be afraid. Stand up for yourself. One day the notoriously nasty Lisa Bucker and her friends dragged me kicking and screaming to the school dumpster, which was behind the classrooms and faced the wooded area at the back of the school. I'll never forget that I was thrown violently into this disgusting, revolting and repulsive dumpster that stank to high heaven and was filled with leftover pig swill, such as potatoes, carrot peelings, rotten tomatoes, banana skins, and boxes of peaches that had gone soft and squidgy and were past their best. If things could get any worse, they invariably did. Lisa proceeded to empty plastic bags that were filled with leftover porridge oats, mashed potatoes, and squidged up cauliflower cheese, and she poured this over the top of my head until I was drenched and literally covered with the stuff, and it began to run down my face. "There you are," she sneered jovially. "Look at her now, everybody," she hooted with laughter. "Maybe the oats will give her a few more brain cells, as they're supposed to enhance your cognitive ability, but I'm not sure oats are any good for cotton wool brains, and that's probably what Ariel's got. So I don't know if the oats are going to work. Sorry, Ariel." Everyone took their turn to immerse me with unmentionable layers of soft plums, blackened banana skins, leftover spaghetti, and they were crackling with laughter, almost like witches. It was just awful. "Look how pretty she looks now," sneered Lisa. "Anyone fancy dating little Ariel? Who fancies dating this pile of pig swill and going on the date with Miss Cotton Brains? I certainly doubt anybody would want to." That was how nasty she was. It was quite frightening that anybody could be this cruel. I remember I stood up in the bin crying my heart out. I was covered with all this ghastly, horrible muck. I could hear the girls laughing as they slammed the pedal bin down on me and hooted with laughter. I'm so glad I was such an amusement for them, I thought. For a long while I stood buried beneath layers and layers of this ghastly food that covered me from top to bottom, and it stunk to high heaven. But I wasn't prepared to move, not for a moment, not until I was absolutely certain that the girls did not come back. I didn't want them seeing me get out of the bin, covered in all this ghastly filth, to give them yet another opportunity to have a good laugh at my expense. I just couldn't let that happen. Suddenly I heard a loud, thundering noise, bounding towards the dumpsters at a very fast speed, sounding almost like a steam train on full throttle. I was certain that Lisa was putting on some crazy act to pander to all her adoring followers, or the wolf pack, so to speak. She was making a very strange breathing noise like a horse, and was opening one dumpster after another. I was pretty certain that it was Lisa Bucker, and I couldn't imagine what she was planning to do next, but she was certainly coming back to torment and ridicule me further. So despite the fact that I was covered from head to toe with all this rotting filth and nasty-smelling putrid garbage, I was not going to move a muscle, not to give her any satisfaction whatsoever. I know I thought, as the bins were open and I lay beneath the layers of rotting flesh, that she was coming back, and she was going to make as much fun as possible of me and humiliate me in every possible way. To my amazement, something appeared to be poking around in the bin above my covered head and was breathing like a horse. But this time it genuinely sounded like a horse, not like someone was acting like they were breathing like a horse. It wasn't Lisa, I realised. But then who was it, I wondered. I pushed my head through the sea of debris that covered my entire head to find myself staring face to face with a huge, hairy ape-like humanoid, and in that moment I do not know who was more shocked, me or the critter. In his humongous hands he was holding 2 blackened bananas, which he dropped into the bin immediately as he became so startled by surprise shock to see me standing up in there, just covered with all this filth. I was clearly the last thing that he expected to encounter when dumpster diving, for overripe fruit, I imagine. I promise you I will never forget the puzzled, baffled and befuddled look on his face. He looked profoundly shocked, to say the least, to see me in this bin, submerged from top to bottom with pig swill that was running down my face in huge streaks by this time. For a second we just stared at each other, and for a long time, as though frozen in time, you would have thought that the creature would have bolted, but for some bizarre reason he was too shocked to even move, because he froze like a statue. The creature was unlike anything I've ever observed or seen before, but next to my nasty friends, it was like I was seeing God himself. I know that sounds incredibly crazy, because this creature was terrifying to look at, and yet I could sense his warmth presence that was so comforting, like the smell of cinnamon buns on a freezing cold day. That was what his presence was like. I immediately rifled through the contents of the bin, looking for peaches and plums that were not too bad, or at least not in such terrible shape, and I reached for a crumpled plastic bag that I found lying next to me, and started piling the fruit in the bag, and I handed it to the critter. The creature took the bag from me and inspected the fruit closely to check for himself, and it clearly met with his approval, because he made a very happy, pleased, chattering sound, and even ate a peach in front of me, all the while studying me with a curious, keen interest, as if to say, "What do you get out of standing there in the bin like that?" I climbed out of the bin, covered in sludge, and the creature kept watching me in absolute intrigue and fascination, and even offered me one of the peaches, which was really rather endearing and sweet. I really think he was wondering why I put myself into the dumpster, and found it all very intriguing, and I think this was going over and over in his head, because he just found it so peculiar. I went over to the other dumpsters and looked through the contents with the critter yards away from me, as we began to select some bananas, some grapes and some red apples together that were still in relatively good nick. I handed them to the critter, who put them in his bag. It was so weird and peculiar, because in a strange way I felt so at ease and comfortable with this critter. I remember thinking afterwards that Lisa Bucker looked pretty and sweet on the surface, but on the inside she was a seriously scary, nasty girl. And the critter looked terrifying on the outside, but on the inside I could see he had a heart of gold. The critter looked at me with really big, bright, sparkling eyes, and I sensed that he rather liked me. And then he reluctantly pointed to the woods, as if he was trying to tell me that he needed to go, and I immediately felt very sad. He turned and glided away, and in his hand he carried a big bag of the very ripe fruit. He turned around and nodded. I watched him move, and he was so beautiful, agile, lofty and gracious. It would seem some of the fruit the school actually threw away wasn't completely spoilt, and I imagine the hairy critter made regular trips to the dumpster for some seriously good snacks. I really felt that I had scored, because while the others had covered me with all this ghastly garbage, I had encountered an angel that day that had brought joy to my heart and a skip to my step. The creature I saw that day was possibly about 7 foot tall, 500 pounds and 3 foot wide, and it was muscular and strong, with very overlong arms and long legs, and huge hands and feet. I remember it had a very distinct cone-shaped head, and the most beautiful expressive face, with very deep-set brown eyes. It was covered in long, shaggy, silver-grey hair, and he had all the characteristics that are so clearly seen in a Bigfoot today. He definitely looked half ape and half human. I realise all these years later that the creature that I actually encountered that day was a Bigfoot, a Yeti, or a hairy man, although I've never ever breathed a word about it until now in your anonymous forum. I remember walking past the girls who'd thrown me into the bin, covered in swill, with a proud swagger to my step, because I had encountered the most awesome creature, and they hadn't. I remember Lisa Bucker looked crestfallen, that I hadn't scurried away like a frightened mouse, as I retreated to the shower to wash off the muck, walking very proudly, with a very self-assured gait. I'll never forget how mad she looked. To cut a long story short, when my dad realised how miserable I was in boarding school, and I told him about the incessant bullying, he stood up to my mother for the first time in his life and insisted that I came back home, which caused my mother to become very aggrieved and angry. Before long, I became the reason why my parents began to bicker, argue and fight, until one day my mother decided she'd had enough and she was going to leave my dad for good, and that was the best thing that happened to me in my young life, and as you would imagine, she left me to be raised by my dad. I remember my dad saying, "It's just you and me, kiddo, against the whole wide world." About a year or so later, my dad finally got remarried to another lady called Patsy, who became my stepmother, and she loved me as if I was her own daughter, and our home became such a happy place. Patsy rebuilt my confidence and enabled me to come out of my shell. She encouraged me to believe in myself again, and before long I was popular in school, receiving top marks. It was a huge transformational turnaround for me. But if you think my story ends here, you would be very wrong. And to all the bullies out there, be very careful who you bully, because it might just come back to bite you. Many years later, I was working as a judge in misdemeanors court cases that included things like public intoxication, prostitution, theft, vandalism, reckless driving, indecent exposure, and possession of cannabis. In my line of business, Class A misdemeanors are considered the very worst, because it may require a full year spent in jail. I also deal with crimes in various categories that could be personal crimes, property crimes, and of course financial crimes, which I won't go into now. The bad news for many is a misdemeanor can stay on your record for life, which can affect your ability to rent property or to be recruited for a job, which is why I always recommend a defence attorney that can help significantly in those situations. Imagine my surprise when I realised that a woman called Lisa Bucker was in my courtroom for a Class A misdemeanor for reckless driving, as she'd been racing through red lights and driving at excessive speeds, endangering the lives of pedestrians and narrowly missing killing someone crossing the road as she had ploughed through a red light at excessive speed. I still remember the day that Lisa Bucker entered my courtroom with an insolent expression on her surly face. I recognised the long blonde hair and those cold, heartless blue eyes almost immediately. "Do you recognise me?" I asked Lisa, giving her a broad beam. "Because, my dear, I most certainly remember you, rather too well, I'm afraid." "Your Honour, I don't recognise you," said Lisa, looking puzzled, as to why on earth she could possibly know me. "Do you remember the time when you stuffed a little girl into the dumpster, and you covered her with pig swill and porridge oats? Do you remember?" "You're Ariel," gasped Lisa, looking mortified. "Yes, I'm indeed her, the very girl you described as having cotton wool for brains. Well, this cotton wool has qualified as a judge." Lisa looked at me with her mouth hanging open. "I didn't mean it, Your Honour. It was a silly prank." "Really?" I said. "I think you meant it, Lisa. You certainly convinced your adoring fans to believe that I was an airhead." "I'm sorry, Your Honour. I wasn't thinking straight at the time." "Oh, I think you were, Lisa. I really do." "What do you do for a job, Lisa, may I ask?" "I don't work," said Lisa. "I live with my parents." "Why does that not surprise me?" I said. Now tell me, Lisa, what is this I hear about you driving through red lights like a maniac and nearly running over a pedestrian? I was upset, Your Honour. My boyfriend broke up with me. I was devastated. I wasn't really thinking what I was doing. I was upset when you put me in the bin, Lisa, all those years ago. But I didn't nearly run you over by thundering through a red light. You nearly killed someone, Lisa, and that's very serious. Luckily for you, the pedestrian scurried out of your way, but imagine if you'd killed her through your reckless incompetence. You endangered somebody's life, Lisa, and that's very serious indeed. You need to think before you act, not the other way round, because next time you may end up killing someone, and imagine living with that on your conscience. I'm sorry, Your Honour. Oh, please be lenient on me. Well, irrespective of what you may believe, Lisa, given our rather unsavoury history, I'm going to be lenient on you today, and I'm sentencing you to 90 days in jail, a $1,000 fine, and a ban on driving for a year. I looked at everyone in the courtroom and said, if any of you think about bullying your classmates, one day you might be on the receiving end of their mercy, as Lisa is today on mine. I'm giving her a lenient sentence, and I'm not allowing her horrendous bullying of me as a young girl to influence my judgment today, which is very lucky for you. Others might not be as forgiving as I am, but I do forgive you, Lisa, for what you did. I slammed down my hammer on the wooden desk, and Lisa looked at me with a bemused expression on her face and said, "Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you so much." So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to say what an extraordinary story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.